My name is Sarah Feinberg. I'm originally from France and I have worked in the United States for a few years. And I made Aliyah 2 years ago, and since then I'm working at the Institute for National Security Studies. I'm a daughter of a couple of Soviet dissidents who were expelled from the former Soviet Union in the 1970s. My dad was imprisoned in a psychiatric prison for 5 years. And so I grew up in a milieu of Soviet human rights defenders and dissidents in Paris. Yeah, I taught at Columbia University, and I was a visiting fellow at the Harriman Institute at Columbia, and then I taught as a visiting professor at Georgetown University. So there are a few reasons for this sudden intervention of Russia in Syria. First of all, this was a very carefully prepared operation. This is the kind of operation that has been prepared for months with the Russian military establishment and security establishment, and I do believe that it was a plan B. It was a plan B that Russia prepared on the table in case the situation on the ground deteriorates and in case there was a significant weakening of Assad's stronghold in Syria. And that's exactly what happened. What we've seen in the course of September was a weakening of the Assad regime that controls no more than 30% of the greater Syria, of the integral Syrian state. And Russia, in light of the retreat of the Assad forces, decided to intervene. Why is it important? Because Syria is the first stronghold of Russia in the Middle East, especially since the Iranians have signed an agreement with a P5+1, meaning that Russia is expecting a rapprochement between Iran and the United States and is afraid of being avoided in this new partnership that Iran is creating with the West, basically. So for Russia, it was very important to keep the stronghold alive. It's important as a competitor to the United States on the Middle Eastern scene. It's important to keep the naval base of Tartus, which is the only Russian base on the Mediterranean. And it was also important from a domestic point of view. As you know, in Russia, there is a power struggle within the Kremlin, and Putin is not in a strong position at the moment. He's been challenged because of the economic sanctions. And for him, it's very important to gain some political capital, some political dividends in face of competitive groups within the Kremlin. Russian foreign policy is always a result of Russian internal struggles, internal political struggles. And when you see that there is an escalation, whether in Ukraine or in Syria, it is very often the result of an internal conflict between Putin's clans and alternative clans. One of these clans is the clan of the military industrial complex. And this is a clan that pushes forward for a stronger military intervention of Russia, whether in Ukraine or in the Middle East. Syria is a very old Soviet ally. Okay, so there is a very strong historical and political relationship that has lasted for more than 40 years. Second, as I've mentioned, Syria is the only country where not only you have Russian spies all over the country, and we know here in Israel that the Golan Heights are completely infiltrated with Russian spies, but it is also a country with a very strong Russian military presence. Since the beginning of the civil war in Syria, back in 2011, Russia has supplied Syria with fighter jets, with advisors, with drones, with all kinds of defense equipment for the entire period of the civil war. For Russia, supporting Assad today is a way to keep and to strengthen what we call in Israel the radical axis, or the Shiite axis, the axis of Tehran, Damascus, and Hezbollah. And despite the fact that Russia is trying to mitigate its alliances and seduce the Sunni states at the same moment, it is playing at the moment when we're talking, it is playing the Shiite card in order for many different reasons that we can discuss at the moment. Since the Soviet period, the Middle East, whether in Egypt, before the Russians were kicked out, or in Syria, this was a region with a lot of Russian spies, and this explains the extreme sophistication and the extreme, the advanced knowledge of the Russians, that the Russians have of the Middle East. If you look at the Soviet school or the Russian school of Middle Eastern studies and the American school, you see that Russia is a country that is much stronger because of this infiltration of Soviet and Russian spies at the time. There is a misconception in the United States about Putin's support of Bashar al-Assad. His support is not an unconditional support. Russia has made clear that this was a murderous regime, that this one of the most brutal regime ever in the Middle East. Russia has made clear that it doesn't support Bashar al-Assad per se. It does support the integrity and the sovereignty of a secular Syrian state. At the moment, it means supporting Bashar al-Assad, but in principle, it doesn't mean supporting this personality, this dictator per se. And I believe that the Saudis and the Americans are making a mistake, or maybe are overstating this for political purposes. Now, it is not in the interest of Russia today to support Assad per se, because it does alienate Russia from the partnerships it has created over the years with the Sunni states, like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. It does also infringe upon the possibility of having a political solution in Syria, and that's what Russia is looking for. Russia at this juncture is looking for a rapid political settlement of the Syrian conflict. And for them, being able to compromise on Assad, meaning a restriction of his sovereignty or his full exit from the Syrian scene, enables the Syrian moderate opposition to come to the negotiation table and then hasten a political dialogue and a political solution in Syria. And this is Russia's goal at the moment. On the ISIS question, ISIS became a problem of strategic dimension for Russia only back in June 2015. Prior to this date, the Russian official position is that the Islamic State doesn't represent a strategic threat for the world, nor for Russia itself, for the Russian Federation. We've seen a drastic change in June, which was related to the declaration of the Emirate Caucasus, declaration of obedience of the Emirate Caucasus, which is a territory that is located in the Caucasus. They declared their obedience to ISIS. And what we've seen in the Caucasus was a shift of Islamist fighters from Al-Qaeda to Daesh, to the Islamic State. So we've seen over the years the mounting of the influence of ISIS in this area. And since this declaration, Putin's official position was to say that ISIS became a strategic threat for Russia. Remember that Russia is home to 20 million Muslim citizens, most of whom are Sunnis, out of a population of 147 million Russian citizens. Remember that there is a drastic radicalization of Muslims not only in the Caucasus, but also in the Volga and the Ural regions of Russia, which are homes to traditional moderate Islam and now we see the rise of terrorist activities in these areas. So basically, since this period, Russia has called for the creation of an alternative coalition against ISIS, a coalition that would be much more efficient than the coalition that was built upon by the United States. And basically, they created this coalition by entering into Syria. What is this coalition about? It gathers together Russia, the Syrian army of Bashar al-Assad, the Iraqis are giving political backing. They're not militarily involved, but they're giving political backing. And the Iranians, at this stage, there are approximately 3,000 Iranian fighters located in Syria, and Shiite militants coming from Afghanistan and from other parts of the world. So Russia has created de facto this ground and air defense coalition against ISIS. Now we're talking together a few days after the crash. It is interesting to mention that the Russian media and the Russian official position has been very careful in terms of qualifying this event, in terms of defining it or not as a terrorist attack committed by ISIS. What does it mean? It means that Russia is today at a crossroads, and that the Russians are preparing a counter-strategy. And they have a dilemma. They have to choose today. If ISIS, which seems at this stage likely, at least according to British and Israeli intelligence, and the Americans recorded conversations by the Russians who have acknowledged among themselves that it was most probably ISIS. The dilemma is as follows. Either launch a big ground operation into Syria and present this operation as a justification for the Syrian intervention. And you know that the Syrian intervention has been condemned based on the fact that most of the Russian strikes were not conducted against ISIS, but against other groups, some of which are fighting ISIS on the ground, such as the Syrian moderate opposition. So either it will use it as a justification to launch a major ground operation, or, which I believe at this stage is the most likely scenario, it will hasten a political settlement of the Syrian conflict and try to find a political solution to the expansion of ISIS. It could be as follows. The Russians, as you know, initiated and participated in two major conferences in Vienna, one that took place on October 23rd and the other one on October the 30th. And the idea is to call for a transition government in Syria. They've called just this morning for a transition period of 18 months. They even agreed that this transition period could be without Bashar al-Assad. Without Bashar al-Assad. So the Russians are not ready to die for Bashar al-Assad. And in this new Syria, you have a few options, and the Russians are not clear about the map. Officially, they call for the preservation of a viable, secular, integral Syrian state with a few autonomous regions inside, like a Kurdish autonomous region, an Alawite region, and a Sunni region. The borders that we're having today. So this is the official position. In this map, in this ideal and highly unlikely map, ISIS would get a mini-state within the Syrian state. And the Russian thinking goes as follows: let's keep a Sunni state and clear it from its most difficult terrorist elements. So we will institutionalize ISIS in a way and send all these terrorists out of the country. So this is one scenario. Another scenario that I think is more likely to happen is to say, let's preserve an Alawite state, either a restricted Alawite state with minimal borders or an extended Alawite state, which would include Aleppo and which would be much larger than the territories that are currently controlled by Bashar al-Assad, and let's just contain ISIS. So you would have a Kurdish state in that situation, which would anger the Turks, but the Russians have called for the creation of a Kurdish state, and I believe Israel is not against. And then you would have this limbo, this kind of proto-terrorist state, and the Russians would say, we've done our part, now it's time for the world to unite and contain ISIS. We cannot defeat ISIS, but we can contain ISIS. In that case, what is good for Russia? Russia would have demonstrated its military strength, because the Syrian operation is all about showing to the world how Russia is advanced in terms of its military production, because it was a kind of military theater to the world. And remember that the main Russian business in the Middle East is arms sales. So for the Russians, it's highly important. And it would have preserved its strongholds in Syria. It would have created a unique combination that never existed during the Soviet period, meaning having an air base, Latakia, that exists alongside a naval base on the Mediterranean. So for the Russians, this is a very strong accomplishment that they will never relinquish, abandon, and they would have hastened a political solution in Syria. What it means for the Russians, it means that they would have a very strong negotiating card to hasten a political solution in Ukraine. And remember that the end game for the Russians is not Syria, is not even the Islamic State, even though you have more than 5,000 fighters from the former Soviet state who are currently fighting in Syria and Iraq. The final game is about Ukraine, is finding a settlement in Ukraine that will preserve Russian interests and that will achieve the lifting of economic sanctions in Russia. Because the economic sanctions at this very moment are not only a threat to the Russian economy, they're a threat to the very stability of Putin's regime. Technically, he could remain in power for many years forward until at least 2020. He could run for another term. But the problem is, and we've seen tangible signs this past year, especially after the murder of Boris Nemtsov, of the Russian oppositionist Boris Nemtsov, we've seen signs of a growing internal instability in Russia. And this instability is, of course, triggered by the economic sanctions. And actually, it was the main American agenda. The main American agenda was not only about hurting the Russian economy, it was about creating a leverage inside the Kremlin to have the Russians surrender to American pressure. I would like someone to explain to me what the US policy is all about in Syria vis-à-vis Putin. I believe it's a big mystery at the moment, and it's probably a mystery to many American experts. With regard to Putin, it is crystal clear that the Americans are taking him seriously. The first reason is that Putin introduced a game changer in Syria. And they've changed completely the game for the Western coalition. The Americans are sending ambivalent messages vis-à-vis Putin's policy in Syria. On the one hand, they do support the Russian initiative against ISIS. And they're ready to a certain extent to collaborate with the Russians. should the Russian operation prove successful. At this stage, it's not successful. It's not so successful. On the other hand, they're condemning the Russian operation for weakening the Syrian moderate operation. And as you know, the Americans have sent a few days ago 50 special units in order to better equip and strengthen the Syrian moderate opposition. So yes, the Americans are taking the Russians seriously, but they do know that the key lies in the hands. What is the key that the Americans have? This is the economic sanctions. And without the lifting of the sanctions, without the guarantee that NATO will not further expand eastwards on the former Soviet territories, to Georgia, to Ukraine, these are the key countries, Russia cannot really remain the kind of empire, the kind of superpower it aspires to be.